Story number one. When I was younger, maybe 14 or 15 years old, my family used to camp every summer at this state park. It was one of those places that felt familiar and safe, until one night made me rethink that feeling. Every evening, my friend and I had a tradition we called the ritual. After dark, we'd sneak away from our campsite and explore the woods. There was something about walking through the forest at night that gave us a thrill. Most nights, we'd wander around for a bit, joke about spooky things, then head back before it got too late. But this one night, we decided to push further than usual. We were probably half a mile from the nearest campsite, far enough that the glow of campfires and lanterns had disappeared behind the thick trees. We had flashlights, but we liked to challenge ourselves by walking without them on. Navigating in the dark, with only the faint moonlight filtering through the branches, gave us a sense of adventure. As we were moving quietly through the woods, trying not to trip over roots or run into branches, we heard something strange, a soft whispering sound coming from somewhere behind us. We stopped dead in our tracks, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My friend and I exchanged a look, each of us silently asking the other, "Did you hear that?" Without saying a word, we clicked on our flashlights and spun around, sweeping the beams across the trees and underbrush. There was nothing, just darkness and the rustling of leaves in the wind. We stood there for a few moments, listening intently, but the forest had gone completely still. It was like the woods were holding their breath. We convinced ourselves it was nothing, probably just the wind or some animal moving through the brush, and kept walking. But a few minutes later, we heard it again. This time, the whispering was closer, and it sounded off. It wasn't a clear sentence, just a string of words whispered too low for us to make out. The way it drifted through the darkness felt unnatural, like someone was trying to speak but didn't know how. We stopped again, shining our flashlights in every direction. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could tell my friend was starting to feel uneasy too. We scanned the trees, the ground, the shadows, but there was nothing there, just silence. "Maybe we should head back," my friend whispered, and I nodded. We turned around and started making our way back toward the campground, walking faster this time. The thrill of the adventure was gone, replaced by an unsettling feeling that we weren't alone. And then we saw it. About 20 feet away, something moved on the ground, a dark figure crawling through the underbrush, whispering quietly to itself. The beam of my flashlight caught it just for a moment, and that was enough. It was a woman on her hands and knees, muttering random words under her breath. Her clothes were dark and filthy, and her skin was smeared with dirt, making her blend into the forest floor. She didn't seem to notice us at first, just kept crawling, her whispers floating toward us like the wind was carrying them. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My friend whispered, "What the hell is that?" Neither of us moved. Then she saw us. The moment our flashlights hit her full on, she jerked her head up and locked eyes with us. For a second, she just stared, like she was trying to process what she was seeing. Then, without warning, she stood up abruptly, wobbling on unsteady legs. I'm looking for my campsite," she slurred, her voice thick and strange, like she was trying to convince herself as much as us. We were too stunned to respond at first, just standing there in the dark, trying to make sense of the situation. Was she lost? Drunk? High? There was something about her, something off, that made the whole thing feel surreal. After a few awkward moments, we managed to pull ourselves together and offered to help her. She staggered toward us, muttering to herself in that same strange, disconnected way. Her movements were uncoordinated, and every step she took seemed to threaten to topple her over. We walked her back through the woods, keeping close to her in case she fell. The entire time she kept mumbling, her words fragmented and meaningless. It was like she was trying to speak but couldn't string her thoughts together. The closer we got to the campground, the more the tension in my chest started to ease. But that eerie feeling of wrongness never fully left. When we finally reached the edge of the campground, we started looking for her group. We walked from site to site, asking if anyone knew her or had noticed her missing. It took a while, but we eventually found her friends at a campsite near the far end of the grounds. To our surprise, they didn't even realize she was gone. They were sitting around the fire, laughing and drinking, completely unaware that their friend had been crawling through the woods in the middle of the night. When we brought her over, they laughed it off, saying she must have gotten lost trying to find the bathroom. The woman didn't say much after that, just sat down heavily by the fire, rubbing her arms like she was cold. Her friends thanked us casually, like it was no big deal, and we left without much ceremony. If we hadn't gone so far into the woods that night, I honestly don't know what would have happened to her. She could have been out there all night, wandering in circles, lost in the darkness. Maybe she would have found her way back on her own, or maybe she wouldn't have. Story number 2. A couple of years ago, I decided to take a solo camping trip into a valley where I knew I wouldn't have any cell service. I wanted to disconnect and just enjoy some peace and quiet. I hiked a trail a bit too late into the afternoon, though, and by the time I started heading back, it was getting dark fast. As I made my way toward where I had planned to set up camp, I ran into a local guy along the trail. He seemed friendly enough, a bit rough around the edges, but helpful. We got to talking, and when I told him where I was thinking of camping, he offered to show me a better spot, closer to the road and the river but hidden from view. He said not many people knew about it. I figured, why not? It's always good to have local insight. He wasn't lying. The spot was perfect. It was close enough to the road that I could make a quick exit if needed, but it was camouflaged by thick trees, so no one passing by would know I was there. I thanked him, and he went on his way while I set up camp. It was already too dark to bother setting up my tent, so I decided to sleep in the back of my truck under the topper, surrounded by all my gear. I made a fire, cracked open a couple of beers, and listened to one of my friend's comedy podcasts. I didn't care if I was loud. I figured I was completely alone out there. The night was peaceful enough, but something about the darkness felt a bit heavier than usual. I shook it off and stayed by the fire until I got tired, then crawled into the back of my truck to sleep. I remember feeling weirdly lazy for not setting up my tent, but it was more comfortable in the truck anyway. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds and the soft hum of the river nearby. I got up, stretched, and decided to make a fire for breakfast. I cracked a beer, tossed some bacon on the pan, and settled in for a relaxing morning. That's when I saw him. At the edge of my camp, standing just within the tree line, was a man. At first, I thought maybe it was another camper or a fisherman from the river, but something about him felt off. He looked like he'd been living rough for a long time. His beard was long and tangled, and his clothes were a strange patchwork of fabrics. What really stood out, though, were the plastic grocery bags. He had tied them all over his clothes like some kind of bizarre armor. There had to be at least 100 of them flapping softly in the breeze. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring into the distance, never looking directly at me. I tried to be polite, so I commented on how nice the day was. No response. He didn't even flinch, just stood there like he hadn't heard me. I started to feel that cold, creeping sensation in my gut, the one that tells you something isn't right. I offered him some breakfast, figuring maybe he was just hungry. Again, nothing. He just shuffled a little closer, moving around the perimeter of my camp like he was inspecting it. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost like he was pacing. At this point, I was getting seriously uncomfortable. I tried offering him a beer, hoping it would ease whatever weird tension was building. He didn't even acknowledge the offer, just turned slightly away from me, still not making eye contact, and kept pacing around. I realized then that this wasn't going to end well. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, like I was a deer that just noticed the wolf circling. I kept my bear spray and buck knife within arm's reach, but my pulse was starting to race. My mind was flashing with all sorts of worst-case scenarios. What if he'd been watching me all night? What if there were more people waiting nearby? I decided it was time to lay down the law. I stood up, stared straight at him, and said as firmly as I could, "Motherfucker, you are either going to acknowledge me or leave immediately." Nothing. Not even a flicker of recognition. It was like I wasn't even there. That was the moment I knew I had to take control of the situation. I grabbed my bear mace, clicked the safety off, and took a few steps toward him. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if the air had gone out of him, and without a word, he turned around and started shuffling back into the woods. I stood there, bear spray in hand, watching as he disappeared into the trees. He didn't look back, didn't say a word, just melted into the forest like he had never been there. The second he was out of sight, I sprang into action. I didn't waste a single second packing up my gear. I threw everything into the back of my truck as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest the whole time. I didn't even bother putting out the fire properly, just kicked dirt over it and jumped into the driver's seat. As I sped down the road, adrenaline still surging through me, one thought kept circling in my mind. What if he had been watching me all night? I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had set up my tent, things might have gone very differently. I thanked my laziness for staying in the truck. At least I had some solid walls around me while I slept. Story number 3. I was out in the bush one day, hunting for upland birds. It was early morning, and the woods were quiet except for the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of wings in the underbrush. I was in familiar territory and felt completely at ease, until I wasn't. I decided to take a shortcut through a shallow valley to get to another spot I liked. It was off the beaten path, but I knew the area well and had used the route before. The walk was peaceful at first. I kept my shotgun slung over my shoulder and moved quietly, listening for the telltale flutter of birds taking flight. Then I saw him. As I rounded a bend in the trail, there he was, a man standing dead center on the path, holding an AR-15 at the ready position. Instantly, every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Something deep inside me screamed that this was a situation I did not want to be in. I forced myself to stay calm, but my heart was already racing. I knew I had to play it cool. The last thing I wanted was to look like a threat to someone carrying a semi-automatic rifle. "Hey," I called out, keeping my voice as steady and friendly as I could manage. "Just out bird hunting. How are you doing?" The man stared at me, his expression unreadable. His eyes were cold, almost vacant, and I could tell right away that this wasn't just some fellow hunter out enjoying the woods. After a long, awkward pause, he finally responded. "Fine," he said slowly, drawing out the word. Then, after another unsettling silence, he added, "I'm hunting deer." That set off every alarm bell in my head. For starters, it wasn't deer season. And even if it were, an AR-15 isn't a legal hunting rifle for deer. On top of that, the guy didn't look like any hunter I'd ever seen. He wasn't wearing the usual camo or orange safety gear, just filthy, ragged clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His beard was long and matted, and his eyes had that sunken, hollow look you sometimes see in people who've been using meth for a long time. The man standing in front of me looked more like a drifter or someone living off the grid than a hunter. I realized I'd stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. Whether it was a meth lab or some other illegal operation, I had no doubt that I needed to get out of there, and fast. Still trying to stay calm, I gave him a friendly nod and asked, "Do you know the best way for me to go to find some birds?" He stared at me for a long moment, his fingers shifting slightly on the rifle. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Then finally he spoke. "Well, I imagine you might find some back the way you came." His tone had changed. There was a sharpness to it, a thinly veiled warning that sent a chill down my spine. He was telling me, in no uncertain terms, to leave the way I came. And I wasn't about to argue with a man holding a rifle. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "That makes sense. Thanks for the tip. I'll head that way." I turned slowly, making sure to keep my movements casual. My shotgun stayed slung over my shoulder. I didn't want to give him any reason to feel threatened. As I started back the way I'd come, I could feel his eyes on me the entire time, burning holes in the back of my head. I kept my pace steady until I rounded the next bend in the trail, and then I picked it up. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct in my body was screaming to get the hell out of there. I made it back to my truck without incident and just gassed off. I wonder what was down that trail, whether it was a meth lab, a camp, or something else entirely. But I'm thankful that I trusted my instincts and backed off when I did. Story number 4. A couple of years ago, I went on a solo camping trip deep into the middle of nowhere in north-central Pennsylvania. It was one of those trips where the goal wasn't really about reaching a specific spot. I just wanted to get far away from everything. I drove for over an hour on dirt Forest Service roads that cut through dense woods. After parking where the road ended, I hiked about 6 miles in on a trail that was barely recognizable, like it hadn't been used in months. The trail was completely overgrown, with tall grass and brush swallowing the path. Spiderwebs stretched across the trail, which told me no one had come through recently. It was rocky and uneven, running alongside a narrow creek in a valley. I didn't have a specific destination in mind, just wanted to find a flat spot to camp for the night. But as the sun started dipping below the horizon, I realized I needed to stop soon. Just as I began worrying about finding a suitable spot, the trail led me to a fork in the creek. Right on the other side of the water was the perfect campsite, a rare flat patch of ground tucked between the trees. I was relieved to have found a place to settle in before nightfall, but that relief didn't last long. As I crossed the creek to check out the area, I noticed there were things scattered around, random objects that made my stomach twist with unease. The first thing I saw was a tarp lying on the ground near a stone fire ring. A thick log, about a foot in diameter, had been chopped with an axe and left there. That was strange enough, but the deeper I looked, the stranger things became. A few feet away from the tarp, I found the entire contents of what you'd expect to see in a hiker's backpack. Food, a cooking set, a camping pad, a first aid kit. All of it strewn across the ground. But there was no actual backpack in sight. The mess looked recent too, like it hadn't been there more than a day or two. Down by the creek, I spotted a pile of wet clothes that had obviously been rained on during the storm the day before. A towel was hanging from a low tree branch nearby, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. And not far from the towel, there was an area where someone had been using the bathroom. At least 10 to 14 days worth of toilet paper piles scattered around the spot. Then I found the weirdest thing. Near the edge of the campsite, there was a crude frame, about 4 feet by 4 feet, built out of saplings tied together. It looked like a cube, with diagonal crossbars on each side to reinforce it, but the frame was flimsy, with large gaps between the branches. It wouldn't have been sturdy enough to hold anything inside, and it was too small to be a shelter. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The thing gave me an uneasy feeling that I couldn't shake. It was nearly dark, and I didn't have many options. If I wanted to leave, I'd have to hike the 6 miles back in complete darkness, on an overgrown trail, without knowing what else might be lurking nearby. So despite every instinct telling me to get the hell out of there, I decided to stay the night. I set up my sleeping bag near the fire ring, but kept my 12-inch knife within arm's reach the entire time. My grip on that knife was tight. I wasn't going to sleep easy, knowing someone had clearly been here recently. And I couldn't stop thinking about that weird wooden cube. What was it for? Why leave it out here in the middle of nowhere? All night I lay awake, straining to hear any movement in the dark. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I kept imagining some guy creeping out of the woods, watching me from just beyond the firelight. I tried to convince myself that it was just some abandoned camp, but the nagging question remained. Where was the person who left all this stuff behind? I must have drifted off at some point because I woke to the first light of dawn creeping through the trees. The moment the sun came up, I packed everything as quickly as I could and got the hell out of there. I didn't even bother eating breakfast, just threw my gear together and started hiking back to my truck. Once I made it back to the Forest Service road, I took a few deep breaths, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. But I couldn't stop thinking about that weird camp and the strange wooden frame. When I got home, I called the Forest Service and told them about what I had found. I even sent them pictures of the site, hoping they could explain it. The ranger I spoke with was calm, but clearly intrigued. He told me it was probably one of 3 things: someone with a moonshine still hidden nearby, someone growing pot, or just some loner living deep in the woods. None of those answers made much sense to me. I had scouted up the sides of the valley the night before setting up camp and hadn't found anything that looked like a still, and the area wasn't really suitable for growing pot, too rocky and shaded by the trees. They haven't found anything yet. Story number 5. In the late 80s, when I was in my early 20s, 2 friends and I decided to go camping in Central Florida. At the time, 2 of us were working for the Park Service, which gave us the perk of being able to camp for free at other parks in the state. We were both experienced campers. I'd grown up camping with my family every vacation, all over the state, from the beaches to the swamps. But for the other friend who came along, this was her very first camping trip. We chose to camp in the youth area of the park that weekend. The main campground was a little too busy, and the youth area, which was isolated and quiet, felt like the perfect spot to relax. It was completely empty that weekend, so we had the whole section to ourselves. The second afternoon, as the sun started to dip below the horizon, we lit the bonfire and settled in for the evening. One of the rangers who lived on site, about a quarter-mile away, drove over with a truckload of firewood and a six-pack of beer. He joined us for a while, and we all sat around the fire, chatting and enjoying the cool evening air. Sometime after dark, we heard what sounded like a group of teenagers messing around on one of the nearby trails. The trails were supposed to be closed after sunset, so the ranger and my coworker decided to drive over and shoo them back to their campsites. That left me and our other friend alone by the fire, just relaxing and soaking in the peace and quiet. It was one of those perfect camping nights, until it wasn't. Out of nowhere, a cold chill washed over me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. It was like a switch had been flipped in my brain. 1 second, everything was normal, and the next I was gripped by a feeling of overwhelming terror. It wasn't just unease or discomfort. It felt like something was wrong, very wrong. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as just my imagination again. But the fear kept growing, like a pressure building inside my chest. I didn't want to say anything to my friend. I didn't want to scare her. But then I glanced over at her, just as she turned to look at me. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I think maybe we better go to the car." Neither of us had any idea what was out there, but we both felt it. The overwhelming sensation that we were in serious danger. We stood up slowly and started walking toward the car, trying our best to act casual, like everything was fine. But every step we took, the fear grew. It was like the darkness around us had come alive, pressing in on us from all sides. About halfway to the car, we both stopped and looked at each other, eyes wide. Without saying a word, we broke into a dead run. We sprinted the rest of the way to the car, hearts pounding, panic surging through every muscle. The moment we reached it, we jumped in, slammed the doors and locked them. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the keys and turned on the headlights. We sat there in the car, gripping the seats and staring straight ahead. I had a pistol with me, but holding it didn't make me feel any safer. In fact, I remember thinking that the gun wouldn't be enough. Whatever was out there, a pistol wouldn't stop it. I could feel the fear crawling up my spine, and for a moment I had the sickening sense that if I turned my head and looked out the window, I'd see something so terrifying it would break my mind. I couldn't look. Neither of us could. We just sat there, rigid, staring straight ahead, too scared to even breathe. It felt like we sat in that car for hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the fear started to lift. The crushing sense of danger faded, and we both let out long, shaky breaths. A few minutes later, we saw the ranger's truck pull back into the campsite with our other friend. We forced a few nervous laughs, trying to play it cool, but I could tell my friend felt the same way I did. Something had been out there with us. Something we couldn't see, but that we both felt with every fiber of our being. I faced a lot of scary situations in my life, but nothing, not storms, wild animals, or confrontations, has ever made me feel the kind of fear I felt that night. Whatever it was, I'm convinced it wasn't just in our heads. We were in real danger from something, even if we never found out what it was. Story number 6. A couple of years ago, I went on a group camping trip deep in the middle of nowhere in Arizona. There were 6 of us in total, spread out across a few tents at our campsite. It was one of those remote areas where you're completely off the grid. No phone signal, no nearby towns, just desert, wilderness, and sky. Perfect for a quiet weekend with friends. The night started off like any other camping trip. We had a fire going, cooked up some food, drank a few beers, and told stories until we were too tired to stay up. After putting out the fire, we all crashed in our tents. I was sharing one with 2 of my buddies, and after a while, The peaceful sounds of the desert lulled us to sleep. Sometime deep in the night, I was jerked awake by a strange noise just outside our tent. It was subtle at first, soft, slow sniffs, like something was pressing its nose against the fabric of the tent. My heart started racing. I knew right away that something, or someone, was outside, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. My first thought was that it might be a bear, or maybe a coyote scavenging for food. I stayed perfectly still, straining my ears. I could hear the distinct sound of sniffing, moving along the side of the tent. A chill ran down my spine. Did someone forget to tie up the garbage? I thought. I was mentally kicking myself for trusting my friends to keep the camp clean, assuming we'd attracted some animal looking for leftovers. Seconds later, the sniffing stopped at our tent and moved to the next one. In the eerie silence of the night, it was unnerving to hear the faint huffing sound of whatever was out there, poking around our site like it owned the place. At this point, everyone in my tent was awake. We quietly grabbed each other to confirm that we were all hearing the same thing. No one dared speak. We lay there in silence, listening, hearts pounding. Then we heard movement from the other tent. One of our friends inside unzipped it with a sharp rasp of the zipper and leapt out into the night. Hey, get the fuck out of here!" he shouted at the top of his lungs, waving his arms and making as much noise as he could. He wasn't just making noise. He had a gun with him too, and the metallic click of him chambering around was loud and clear. I expected to hear the shuffle of paws or a sudden rustle of leaves as some animal bolted into the desert night. But instead, what we heard made my stomach drop. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. The shadowy figure in the dark scurried backward, fumbling over coolers and knocking over our food supplies as he scrambled to get away. For a moment, he just stood there, hunched over like a wild animal caught in the act, staring back at us. Then, without a word, he took off, disappearing into the darkness beyond the edge of the camp. We stood frozen for a few seconds, processing what had just happened. Our friend who had jumped out stood there, gun in hand, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Meanwhile, the rest of us slowly emerged from our tents, adrenaline kicking in hard. After a quick look around, we realized the guy had already rummaged through our coolers and food stash. The lids were open, and wrappers and bottles were scattered around the site. The creepiest part? It seemed like he hadn't just been interested in our supplies. He had been sniffing the outside of our tents, like he was sizing us up. No one knew what to say. We exchanged glances, each of us visibly rattled by what had just happened. That wasn't just some lost hiker or curious camper. Something about the way he moved, the silence, the way he had gone from tent to tent, sniffing, it felt off, way off. "Pack up. Now," someone finally said, breaking the silence. None of us argued. We moved fast, gathering everything we could and stuffing it into bags without bothering to organize anything. No one wanted to stay there a second longer than necessary. The idea that this guy could still be lurking nearby, watching us from the shadows, was enough to keep us on high alert. In less than 10 minutes, we had everything thrown into the trucks. We didn't care about being neat, just about getting out. With one last scan of the campsite, we hopped in and sped off down the dirt road, leaving the creepy encounter far behind.